Someone asked you what your plan is. Maybe it was a family member at dinner. Maybe it was an old friend you ran into. Maybe it was just someone making conversation. And you felt your stomach drop because you don't have a good answer. You have vague ideas maybe, some interest, a few directions you're considering, but nothing concrete enough to sound convincing when you say it out loud. So you gave them something, some version of an answer that sounded more certain than you feel. And they nodded and moved on, satisfied. But you're left with this tight feeling in your chest because you know the truth. You don't know what you're doing with your life. You don't have it figured out. You can't even see the path clearly, let alone know if you're on the right one. And everyone around you seems to have clarity you're missing. They have 5-year plans and career trajectories and this sense of direction that feels like a foreign language you never learned. While you're just here trying to figure out what you even want, let alone how to get it. This really hit me about 4 months ago. I was at a birthday party for a friend from college, and it turned into one of those accidental reunion situations where people I hadn't seen in years were all in the same room. And the conversations were exactly what you'd expect. Where are you working now? How's your career going? What are you up to these days? And I watched person after person give these confident updates. Someone was 3 years into a medical residency and talking about their specialty plans. Someone else had just made partner at their law firm. Another person was telling this story about their startup and the funding they just secured. Everyone seemed to have this narrative, this clear arc of where they'd been and where they were going. And then someone turned to me, asked the question I'd been dreading since I walked in. What was I doing? And I felt this familiar panic, because I didn't have a story like theirs. I had a job that paid my bills but wasn't a career. I had interests that hadn't coalesced into anything resembling a direction. I had this vague sense that I was supposed to be building towards something but no idea what that something was. So I gave them the version I'd been rehearsing, talked about my current work in a way that sounded more intentional than it felt. Mentioned some projects I was interested in without admitting I had no idea if they'd lead anywhere. Made it sound like I was in this exploratory phase that was totally purposeful and self-directed, when really I was just confused. And they accepted it, nodded along, asked a few polite follow-up questions. But I could see in their face that they were categorizing me, putting me in a box labeled, still figuring it out, in a way that felt less like understanding and more like pity. I left that party early, drove home feeling this heaviness that was hard to name. It wasn't exactly jealousy of their clarity. It was more like this existential loneliness, like everyone else had gotten some instruction manual for life that I'd missed. Like there was supposed to be a moment where everything clicked into place and I just know what I was meant to do, and that moment kept not coming. I got home and sat in my car in the parking lot for a while, just sitting with this feeling. And I started thinking about all the times I'd been asked this question. What are you doing with your life? What's your plan? Where do you see yourself in 5 years? And how I'd never had a good answer. How I'd always felt like I was failing some fundamental test of adulthood by not knowing. I thought about high school when everyone was talking about what they wanted to study in college. And I'd picked something that sounded reasonable but didn't feel like a calling. Just something I was good enough at and didn't hate. Something that kept my options open while I figured out what I actually wanted. Except I got through college still not knowing. Got through graduation watching everyone else walk into jobs or grad school programs with this sense of purpose, while I was just grateful to find something that would pay rent. Telling myself this was temporary, that I'd figure out my real direction soon. And then a few years passed, and I was still in that same mental space of waiting to figure it out, waiting for the clarity to arrive, waiting to wake up one day with a sense of purpose and direction, waiting to become the kind of person who knew what they wanted and how to get it. But the clarity never came, and the waiting started to feel less like a temporary pause and more like my actual life. Like maybe I was just someone who didn't get to have that sense of certainty. Maybe I was going to be permanently in this state of not knowing, while everyone else moved forward with confidence. I started noticing how often I'd begin sentences with, "I'm thinking about," or "I might," or "maybe eventually." How I could never commit to a direction because I wasn't sure it was the right one. How I kept all my options open not because I was being strategic but because I was paralyzed by not knowing which option to choose. And the worst part was how much mental energy it took. Constantly questioning whether I was in the right place. Constantly comparing my lack of direction to everyone else's clarity. Constantly trying to figure out what I wanted while also trying to convince myself and others that I had some kind of plan. I'd have these conversations with my parents where they'd ask about my future with this barely concealed worry. And I'd try to reassure them that I was working on it, that I had ideas, that I was figuring it out. But I could hear how hollow it sounded. How unconvincing. Because I wasn't really figuring it out. I was just existing in uncertainty and hoping it would eventually resolve itself into something that looked like a path. Friends would give me advice. Have you thought about going back to school? What about trying to move into this field or that field? You should talk to this person I know. You should read this book. You should try this thing. And all the advice just made me feel more lost. Because it assumed I had enough clarity about what I wanted to know which direction to move in. But I didn't. I was still at the stage of not even knowing what I was trying to get to. I tried the things you're supposed to try. Made lists of my interests and skills. Took those career assessment tests. Talked to people in different fields. Read books about finding your passion and your purpose. And none of it helped. All of it just reinforced that I was supposed to know something I didn't know. That there was some answer out there I was failing to find. And underneath all of this was this deeper fear. That maybe I was broken somehow. That maybe everyone else had some internal compass I was missing. That maybe there was something wrong with me that I couldn't figure out what I wanted. That maybe I was going to spend my whole life in this state of uncertainty while everyone else moved forward with purpose. I started avoiding situations where I'd have to talk about my future. Started giving vague answers when people asked about my plans. Started feeling this preemptive defensiveness whenever the topic came up because I knew I didn't have a satisfying answer. Knew I was going to disappoint whoever was asking. And the isolation of that was profound. Because you can't really talk about not knowing without it sounding like you're not trying. Without people assuming you're lazy or directionless or just need to apply yourself more. So you keep it to yourself. You pretend you have more clarity than you do. You perform certainty while internally you're drowning in questions. That night after the party, sitting in my car, I felt all of this so acutely. The gap between what I was supposed to be and what I was. The distance between the clarity everyone else seemed to have and the confusion I was living with. The sense that I was fundamentally failing at something basic that everyone else had figured out. And maybe you feel this too. Maybe you're carrying this same secret uncertainty. Maybe you're performing clarity while internally you're lost. Maybe you're surrounded by people who seem to know exactly what they're doing while you can't even figure out what you want. Here's what nobody tells you about being in your 20s or even your 30s. Nobody tells you that not knowing is actually more common than knowing. That most people who seem certain are just better at pretending. That the clarity everyone projects is often just a story they've learned to tell convincingly, even when they're not that convinced themselves. We're taught to treat uncertainty like a problem that needs to be solved. Like not knowing what you want is a temporary state you're supposed to move through quickly on your way to having a clear direction. Like there's something wrong with you if you can't articulate a 5-year plan or a career trajectory or a sense of purpose. But what if uncertainty isn't a problem? What if it's just a state? What if not knowing what you're doing with your life isn't a sign that you're behind or failing or broken? What if it's just where you are right now and that's actually okay? Because here's the truth that nobody wants to say out loud. Having a clear direction doesn't mean you're on the right path. It just means you've committed to a path. And sometimes committing too early, before you really know what you want, just means you end up somewhere you never really wanted to be. Except now you've built a whole life around it and changing direction feels impossible. You're watching people move forward with purpose and assuming that purpose is leading them somewhere good. But you don't actually know that. You don't know if they're happy. You don't know if they chose their path intentionally or just picked something and stuck with it because changing felt harder. You don't know if their certainty is real or just a mask they wear because admitting uncertainty feels too vulnerable. And meanwhile, your uncertainty, your not knowing, that's keeping you open. That's giving you permission to explore. That's preventing you from committing to something before you're ready. That's allowing you to stay in this questioning space where you might actually figure out what you want instead of just accepting what you're supposed to want. But that doesn't make it easier, because the pressure to know is constant. From family who want to understand what you're doing. From friends who are moving forward and making you feel left behind. From society that measures success by how clearly you can articulate your goals and how efficiently you're moving toward them. And from yourself. From that internal voice that keeps telling you should have figured this out by now. That other people your age know what they're doing. That you're wasting time by not having a direction. That every day you spend in uncertainty is a day you're falling further behind. That voice is relentless. And it's so hard to quiet it when everything around you is reinforcing the message that not knowing is failure. That clarity is maturity. That having a plan is success and questioning is stagnation. But what if questioning is actually growth? What if uncertainty is evidence that you're taking yourself seriously enough not to just accept the first path that presents itself? What if not knowing what you're doing with your life is actually a sign that you're brave enough to admit you don't know instead of pretending you do? The hard part is that this realization doesn't make the uncertainty comfortable. It just makes it bearable. It doesn't give you the answers you're looking for. It just takes away some of the shame of not having them. It doesn't make you feel caught up to everyone else. It just helps you stop measuring yourself against their timeline. Because there is no right timeline. There's no age by which you're supposed to have it figured out. There's no deadline for knowing what you want. There's no universal clock that everyone else is on that you're falling behind. But it feels like there is. It feels like you're missing something crucial. It feels like you're the only one still lost while everyone else has found their way. And that feeling is isolating in a way that's hard to describe. Like you're fundamentally alone in not knowing. Like you're the only one who can't figure out this basic thing that everyone else understands. And you can't talk about it honestly because honesty sounds like weakness. Sounds like you're not trying hard enough or thinking clearly enough or applying yourself sufficiently. So you learn to give the answers people want to hear. You learn to make your uncertainty sound like exploration. Your not knowing sound like intentional openness. Your confusion sound like thoughtful consideration. And maybe that's not entirely dishonest. Maybe there's truth in those reframes. Maybe you are exploring and being open and considering thoughtfully. But you're also just lost. And that's okay to admit, at least to yourself, that you don't know what you're doing. That you're trying to figure it out. That some days you feel like you're making progress and other days you feel like you're just spinning in place. So about 2 weeks after that party, I was having coffee with my cousin. She's a few years older than me, and from the outside, her life looks incredibly together. She's a successful architect, married, owns a house, has this whole adult life that seems sorted. And we were talking about that party, about seeing all those people from college. And I was being vague about how it went, not wanting to admit how inadequate it made me feel. But she could tell something was off. And she asked me directly. She said, "You felt behind, didn't you?" And something about the way she said it, the understanding in her voice, made me actually honest for once. I told her, yeah, I did. That everyone seemed to have their lives figured out and I was still trying to figure out what I even want. That I felt like I was supposed to know by now and I just don't. And she was quiet for a moment. And then she told me something that completely shifted how I'd been seeing everything. She said she'd felt that way until she was 33. That she'd spent her entire 20s and early 30s feeling like she was the only person who didn't have clarity. That she'd chosen architecture almost randomly in college and then just stuck with it because changing direction felt impossible once she'd invested so much time and money into the education. She said that she liked her work fine. that she was good at it and it paid well and she built a successful career. But that she wasn't passionate about it the way people are supposed to be passionate about their calling. That it was just what she did, not who she was. And that for years she'd felt like a fraud because she was supposed to have chosen this intentionally with purpose, but really she just picked something and followed through. And I just sat there staring at her because this was not the story I'd imagined. I'd assumed her clarity was real. That her put-together life was built on actual certainty. That she was someone who knew what she wanted and went after it. That she was everything I wasn't. But she was just someone who'd gotten good at hiding uncertainty. Someone who'd learned to perform confidence even when she didn't feel it. Someone who'd built a good life without ever having that moment of clear knowing that everyone's supposed to have. She told me about other people we knew. People whose lives looked sorted from the outside. And she shared what she knew about their actual internal experiences. The person who seemed so committed to their medical career but had told her they sometimes wondered if they'd only chosen it because their parents expected it. The one with the startup who was drowning in anxiety and wondering if they'd made a huge mistake. The one who seemed so confident who'd admitted to her that they had no idea what they were doing and were just hoping no one noticed. And I realized I'd been believing a story about everyone else that wasn't true. I'd been comparing my internal experience of uncertainty to everyone else's external presentation of confidence. I'd been assuming that because they looked like they knew what they were doing, they actually did. That their performance of clarity was evidence of actual clarity. But most people are just performing. Most people are making it up as they go and hoping it works out. Most people have way less certainty than they project. They've just learned to act like they know what they're doing because that's what you're supposed to do. And the ones who really do have clarity, who genuinely know what they want and are confidently moving toward it, they're not the majority. They're just the loudest. They're the ones whose certainty makes them visible, makes them seem like the standard everyone else should be measuring against. But they're not actually representative of most people's experience. My cousin said something else that stuck with me. She said that not knowing what you're doing in your 20s is almost a gift. That it's giving me time to actually figure out what I want instead of committing to something before I'm ready. That the people who seemed most certain at 25 were often the ones having crises at 35 when they realized they'd built a life around a choice they'd made before they really knew themselves. And I started thinking about that differently. About how my uncertainty, my not knowing, wasn't actually evidence that I was behind. It was evidence that I was taking the question seriously. That I was refusing to just pick something to have an answer. That I was willing to sit in the discomfort of not knowing rather than forcing premature clarity. That's not weakness. That's actually courage. It's just that it doesn't look like courage from the outside. From the outside it looks like indecision or lack of direction or not having your act together. But internally, it's the choice to not pretend you know something you don't. To not commit to a path just because you're supposed to have one. To trust that clarity will come when it's real instead of manufacturing it to make other people comfortable. So if you don't know what you're doing with your life right now, if you can't articulate a clear plan or a 5-year vision or a sense of purpose, I need you to hear this. You're not behind. You're not failing. You're not broken or lost or missing something everyone else has. You're just honest about not knowing. And that honesty, that willingness to sit in uncertainty instead of forcing clarity, that's actually more mature than pretending you have answers you don't have. That's more self-aware than committing to something just to have something to say when people ask about your future. And yes, it's uncomfortable. Yes, it's lonely. Yes, it makes you feel like you're the only one who doesn't have it figured out. But you're not. You're just one of the few people who's willing to admit it, at least to yourself. And that admission, that acknowledgement that you don't know, that's where real clarity actually begins. Not in having all the answers, but in being honest about the questions. Not in performing certainty, but in accepting uncertainty as a valid state. Not in forcing yourself onto a path before you're ready, but in trusting that when you're ready, when you actually know, it will feel different than this. Write me a comment about what you're uncertain about right now. You don't have to have it all figured out. You don't have to make it sound more purposeful than it is. Just tell me what you're questioning, what you're trying to figure out, what you wish you knew but don't. And hit that like button if you've ever felt behind because you don't have a clear direction. If you've ever felt like everyone else knows what they're doing and you're the only one still lost. If you've ever given someone a confident answer about your future while internally having no idea. Let's acknowledge that not knowing is more common than we admit. Tell me in the comments about a time when you discovered someone who seemed certain actually had no idea what they were doing either. Or tell me what you're learning to be okay with not knowing. What uncertainty you're trying to accept instead of solve. Because I think we need to talk more honestly about this. About how not knowing is normal. About how clarity isn't something you're supposed to have by a certain age. About how uncertainty isn't a problem to be fixed but a state to be inhabited until you're ready to move out of it. Let's build a space here where we can admit that we don't have it figured out. Where we don't have to perform certainty we don't feel. Where we can be honest about questioning and exploring and just not knowing yet. Where we can support each other in the uncertainty instead of pretending we're more sure than we are. And if you know someone who's struggling with not knowing what they're doing, someone who feels behind because they don't have a clear direction, send this to them. Not as a solution because there isn't one, but as a reminder that they're not alone, that not knowing is valid. That uncertainty doesn't mean they're doing it wrong. Maybe the point isn't to figure it out as fast as possible. Maybe it's to be okay with not knowing until you actually do know. To trust your own timeline instead of comparing it to everyone else's. To understand that clarity comes when it comes, and forcing it early just means committing to something before you're ready. You're not behind. You're not lost. You're not failing at adulting or life or figuring yourself out. You're just in the uncertainty. And that's not a comfortable place to be, but it's not a wrong place to be either. It's just where you are. And where you are is okay. Even when it doesn't feel okay. Even when everyone else seems to be somewhere else. Even when you wish you had answers you don't have. Keep questioning. Keep exploring. Keep being honest about not knowing. Because that's how you eventually get to real knowing. Not by forcing it, but by staying open to it. By trusting that when it arrives you'll recognize it. And until then you're doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing. Which is living in the uncertainty. Learning from it. Growing through it. And slowly becoming someone who knows herself well enough to know what she actually wants. That's not failure. That's the process. And you're right in the middle of it. Right where you're supposed to be. Even when it feels like nowhere at all.